Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squared for boxing news and views from around the internet. It seems that the penny has dropped for unbeaten heavyweight Jarrell Miller in regards to a potential Anthony Joshua fight, with the American admitting it's not realistic right now, and in fact he's always thought that Eddie Hearn's statements to the contrary were straight BS.
All units 10-3, it now appears as though shots are being fired.
So Miller, who's 20-0 with one draw, he is right now preparing to take on 37-4 Frenchman Johann Duhaupas on April 28th in Brooklyn. And that's on a Matchroom USA card, which also features Danny Jacobs. And for clarity's sake, before we go any further, Miller is not signed to Eddie Hearn, but he is working with Hearn, and this is the second Matchroom card that he's appeared on, Matchroom USA card that is. So he is co-promoted by Dimitri Salita and Greg Cohen. So I'll step through a little bit of the history quickly on just what is happening here, because it was Miller who first mooted an Anthony Joshua fight should happen next, that he did think that Joshua would be his next opponent. So I'll get to his recent statements on Eddie Hearn talking BS, a few thoughts on what it all means, because it's not actually often a boxer will come out and actively ridicule a promoter that they're working with, not while they're working with them. And then I'll touch on a couple of the options for, well, what could be next if it isn't Joshua, should he get past Johann Duhaupas April 28th. Okay, buckle in. Let's go. So in January, Jarrell Miller, he started making noises that should he get past his then yet to be determined opponent on April 28th, that he would be in line for a shot at Anthony Joshua, saying, "It's my turn now. Even though I know AJ is scared of me even more than a ton of bricks, you know what time it is. That would be an awesome opportunity to break his face on American TV. I think I deserve it now. To tell you the truth, compared to these guys who AJ has fought, who Deontay has fought for their title shot, who Joseph Parker fought for their title shot, it's crazy. I feel like I deserve it after this fight." So later, Miller, he stated that Eddie Hearn, Joshua's promoter, who he is working with, that Hearn had told him he would be facing Joshua next if he won his next fight. And when this sort of was said, I mean, generally it was sort of greeted with a bit of derision, some chuckles that, you know, he was overreaching and that he was dreaming. But to the surprise of many, Eddie Hearn, he then came out not long after, and this was in February, to mostly back up what Miller was saying. And he indicated, yes, he was looking at making Miller vs. Joshua for August, saying, like I said, if it's not Deontay Wilder, which I can't see that fight happening anytime immediately, Jarrell is the guy. For Anthony to come to Brooklyn, fight a kid out of Brooklyn for the World Heavyweight title, that's a big fight. But we need the excuse from Jarrell for people to say, that's a good fight. And that will come with a dominant victory against Duhaupas if he can get it. And those Eddie Hearn comments, well, they did coincide with the media associated with the April 28th Matchroom USA card. So the cynical among us, well, we did wonder, was it really designed to generate some buzz to further the interest for that event? Was it really realistic, Miller vs. Joshua? And since then, the prospect of Miller vs. Joshua, it's seemingly become a more distant and remote prospect. So negotiations for an undisputed clash with Deontay Wilder, that's overtaken it, and as too has the WBA mandatory for Joshua, and that's in the form of Alexander Povetkin. That's been called now. So on the face of it, at this point in time, it looks like Deontay Wilder is next if they can make a deal, but if not, Alexander Povetkin. And even though Eddie Hearn has kept mentioning Miller's name, he's been throwing him into the conversation. It does feel like he's a third option at best. And one thing I've been watching for is, how much has Anthony Joshua actually been talking about Jarrell Miller? Because ultimately, Joshua is the one that makes the calls on his fights. And the fact that Joshua is barely saying Miller's name, I don't take that to be that he's avoiding him or ducking him. He's just not interested in him. He's actually talking more about a rematch with Dillian Whyte. He's uttering that more than Miller's name. So instead of being a potential third cab off the rank, Miller could actually well be further down the pecking order. And also consider that Joshua has expressed a desire, for the moment at least, to keep boxing in the United Kingdom because he likes what he's built there. So will he go to Brooklyn in August if everything else falls over? I'm not so sure he would. I mean, some part of me does wonder in relation to that, and I've mentioned this before, what tensions are starting to build with Eddie Hearn and Joshua on this, because Eddie Hearn obviously has ambitions to expand into the United States and really build a bit of an empire there, but Joshua has to be a big part of that. Jarrell Miller, Danny Jacobs, they're building blocks, but they can only take Eddie Hearn so far to crack the United States. He needs Anthony Joshua to really help him crack the US. So some of the reality of the situation, coupled potentially with the lukewarm reaction from fans to a Miller vs Joshua fight, because no one's really calling for that fight just now, it must have started to hit home with Miller. Because now he's done a 180 on some of his previous statements, telling Boxing Scene, from the first time I heard it, and Eddie Hearn was talking about it, I knew in the back of my mind it was just straight BS. You know what I mean? I'll believe it when I see the paperwork. So it never bothered me. But I may just go back to the drawing board and figure out what's next. And then he was asked, well, why doesn't he think that Hearn is serious about matching him against Joshua? So Miller responded, because Eddie Hearn's BS. Promoters are BS. Not just Eddie Hearn, but most of them are. They BS fighters, man. And I must admit, I was really surprised when I read that Miller had actually said those statements, those comments. Especially that he knew it was bullshit all along. And in my view, there's some good and bad aspects to this whole thing with these 180 comments. I'll start with the good. And in terms of that, the longer that Miller continued with the Joshua is next comments, and some of his rhetoric that went with it, sort of Joshua's ducking him, all this sort of stuff, because that was fanciful in itself, the sillier it would have appeared, especially given it's become apparent he's at least third best option for Joshua's next fight. So backing off his Joshua's next comments, it was something he actually did need to do, or at the very least acknowledge in some way that other fights may sort of overtake it or would prevent it. You know, circumstances out of his control, yada yada yada. I mean, I know his manager Dmitry Salita, and this was just last week, he was still fronting that the best fight that can be made in the heavyweight division after unification was Miller vs Joshua. But in reality, it's not. And why is that? Well, simply put, I'm going off on a tangent here. If you are fighting fading title contenders like Mariusz Wach and Johann Duhaupas, how can you realistically generate enough interest from fans, even hardcore fans? I mean, are you excited about Miller vs Duhaupas at the end of the month? I mean, I want to watch the fight, but, you know, I'm not that jazzed about it. And if the starting point for fans for these fights is that the result might depend on how much Wach or Duhaupas has left in the tank, then they're not really the fights that will improve Miller's stock dramatically, even if he does perform well. He is expected to win. I mean, the Gerald Washington fight a year ago when we didn't know so much about Miller, that was a good piece of matchmaking because Miller and Washington, they were seeing as being on a similar level. In Washington, he had been coming off a respectable performance against Deontay Wilder. He looked good in that fight. And so, when Miller dominated Washington, and that was in the pre-fight, in the build-up, and then in the ring, it did feel like it would act as a sort of springboard. But in reality, Miller has effectively taken higher, stay-busy fights as he waits for a title shot. That's what they feel like now. I mean, I would expect Miller will do what he does on April 28th against Duhaupas. He'll apply constant pressure. He'll slowly wear him down, wear him out, and then there'll probably be a retirement or a stoppage somewhere in the rounds, 7 to 11. I don't think this one goes the distance. I think Miller will stop him. He'll wear him down. Could be a retirement, could be a stoppage, but I don't see it going 12. And just on Duhaupas, I know that there's some fans who'd like to say, well, it was Wilder's toughest fight. Come on, give him some credit. But that statement, it doesn't actually take into account the fight against Wilder. It was 3 years ago. And he's got more miles on the clock now, another half dozen fights. He's been knocked out brutally by Povetkin. Admittedly, that was on a day's notice. But he's got more miles now, and he's 37. Either he's past his prime, or he's at, best case scenario, the tail end of it. So I'll just conclude the tangent there. But the effective point being about, it's not tenable for Miller to keep fronting that him and Joshua are next. Especially when fans, they're not really calling for it. People aren't baying for that. And Anthony Joshua's not really interested. He's got bigger fish to fry. Jarrell Miller is an increasingly growing fish, but he's not big enough to cook yet. And in terms of the bad side of it, in terms of what his comments, the 180 comments are, calling out the guy that you work for as talking bullshit, that is never going to foster a good working relationship. I mean, sure, saying it in private is one thing and, believing it, but keep that close to your chest, because openly saying that Eddie Hearn is talking crap publicly, I don't believe that's a smart move at all. Because if that's the case, well, why should we believe anything that Hearn is saying about Miller? Why should we believe anything coming out of his mouth in relation to Miller and his prospects in general? And in particular, Hearn is on record as saying the Duhaupas fight is a 50-50 fight. I certainly never believed that, but Miller needs to realise that Eddie Hearn is in the business of selling hopes and dreams, and that puts bums on seats and eyes in front of TV screens. Surely it's in Miller's interest to toe the line to some degree. And if Miller is attacking Hearn, it could well prove to be counterproductive. And it does actually start to make me wonder if the working relationship is going to end soon, because Miller sort of said these things like he's got nothing to lose. And remember, there was another top heavyweight not so long ago, Luis Ortiz, who was working with Eddie Hearn on a fight-by-fight basis, and because he couldn't get his fight with Anthony Joshua, he ultimately went in a different direction. And that was clear to him, well, this whole thing is not going to work out. I'm not going to get this fight in the time that I want. And he felt that he'd been strung along by Hearn, and maybe Miller is starting to feel the same. The what next? It's not exactly straightforward either for Jarrell Miller. Because with or without Eddie Hearn on the scene, because of unifications and mandatory challenges, they could hold up Miller's title aspirations for some considerable period. So Miller, he's ranked number 3 in the IBF, WBA and WBO. But with Dillian Whyte and Kubrat Pulev set to face off in a final eliminator, that will close the door for some time in the IBF. And in the WBO and WBA, Alexander Povetkin is currently the mandatory challenger. So he's waiting at his shot at Joshua. And even if Povetkin, say, is, the WBA mandatory happens, the WBO one might, come available, but he's likely going to be told you have to fight and eliminate it to secure that mandatory position. And all of this will take time, regardless of whether it's WBO or WBA. No one is going to make him the mandatory off the basis of the body of work that he's created. He's not number 1 in any of the sanctioning bodies. And given that he's not even ranked in the WBC, he can't even think about making a run at that title. So regardless of a win on April 28th, Miller may have to wait some considerable time to get a title shot, and that's with or without Eddie Hearn. And maybe he's starting to realise this, and potentially a realistic scenario for Miller and his title shot is 2019 at the earliest, and even then, who knows. But there's certainly a lot of things that would have to magically fall into place for an August fight with Anthony Joshua to happen. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment loud and often, hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.